And we found as much as 10 degrees Celsius difference between Portage in Maine, which is supposedly the coldest part of Winnipeg, and the airport 8 kilometers away.
Most cities of the world have hotter temperatures than the surrounding countryside. That has nothing to do with carbon dioxide and everything to do with land use. Modern cities have concrete buildings with asphalt roofs that generate heat, which creates artificial heat that elevates the temperature that doesn't really reflect the true climate.
We have balloons that go up through the atmosphere twice each day from locations around the world, and they're in near perfect agreement with the satellite record.
What about the relatively warm year 1998? Was that global warming or a naturally occurring event, such as El Nino?
In 1997-98, we had a major El Nino develop at low latitude, and there was a tremendous amount of water vapor pumped up in the atmosphere, and we had a 1 degree Celsius spike around the world that was noted at that time that disappeared within a few months.
It's not even 25 years ago that the great threat was global cooling. You go back to the 70s and 76, and people like Ponte publishing books called The Cooling, and the scientific consensus then was that we were headed for cooling.
A quote from Newsweek magazine. Now listen to this. This is a quote. It says, "There are ominous signs that the Earth's weather patterns have begun to change dramatically, and that these changes may portend a drastic decline in food production with serious political implications for just about every nation on Earth." Second, a headline in the New York Times reads, "Climate changes endanger world's food output." Here's another quote from Time magazine. "As they review the bizarre and unpredictable weather pattern of the past several years, a growing number of scientists are beginning to suspect that many seemingly contradictory meteorological fluctuations are actually part of a global climate upheaval." All this sounds very ominous. That is until you realize that the 3 quotes I just read were from articles in 1975, editions of Newsweek magazine and the New York Times, and of Time magazine in 1974. They weren't referring to global warming, they were warning of a coming ice age. So the same people who were hysterical back then are using the same words to describe what's happening today. Let me repeat, all 3 of those quotes were published in the 1970s, warning of a coming ice age. The other ice age is coming, we're all going to die.
Senator Inhofe also condemns the one-sided coverage and near-religious zeal by the media of reporting man-caused global warming during a December 6, 2006 Senate hearing.
Much of the mainstream media has subverted its role as an objective source of information on climate change into a role of an advocate. We've seen examples of this overwhelmingly. One-sided reporting by 60 Minutes reporter Scott Pelley, ABC's Bill Blakemore, CNN's Miles O'Brien, which I believe is here with us today or will be, Time Magazine, the Associated Press, Reuters, just to name a few. A report in August of 2006 from the UK's Labour-leaning Institute for Public Policy Research also slammed the media presentation of climate science as, and I'm going to quote here again, this is what they said. These are people who are believers in the other side of this about man-made global warming. "A quasi-religious register of doom, death, judgment, heaven, and hell, using words such as catastrophe, chaos, and havoc." The report also compared the media's coverage of global warming to, quote, "the unreality of Hollywood films." Now, these are the believers we're talking about.
Senator Inhofe is correct. The media has not served the American people well on the global warming issue. As we have already seen, there are serious discrepancies in the man-caused global warming theory. Yet it's not all the media's fault. They are repeatedly told by the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change, the IPCC, that man is causing global warming. The IPCC announced its summary for policymakers during a press conference in Paris in February 2007, announcing that the science had advanced so much that they can now say that man-caused global warming is a 90% certainty.
And the scientific leaders of the world have given us the 4th unanimous report in less than 15 years. They gathered this time in Paris 6 weeks ago. And they said the evidence supporting this consensus is, and I quote them, unequivocal. Unequivocal.
We hear constantly in the media, we hear on a variety of different formats in the news media as well as on specials. Al Gore just produced his video the Inconvenient Truth. He reaffirms time and time and time again in that video that there is no longer any debate. It's a settled science. Well, folks, it's not a settled science by any stretch of the imagination. In fact, a survey was done in 2003 of all climatologists in the world, over 500 of them, that basically said that only 56% of them actually thought man was causing it. When you get down to, is it a settled science? Is it enough to make policy formulation? That drops to 45%. Most scientists are very skeptical at this point that we should be forming policy based on what the science is showing, or at least the science that we're hearing about is showing. Almost 45% of the scientists do not believe man is causing global warming. And that's a long ways from consensus.
Most government and media get the wrong impression by only reading the summaries for policymakers. The alarmist and misleading overviews of the IPCC's science reports.
Now, this summary for policymakers isn't a summary for policymakers at all. It's a summary by policymakers. In other words, it is a summary which is agreed line by line by government representatives. The IPCC is a political organisation set up by the United Nations to provide evidence to support the Framework Convention on Climate Change, which has been signed by governments. It is entirely political.
Just how political is explained by Chris Horner of CNN's Headline News' Glenn Beck Show.
These scientists are generally assigned 1 page to a page and a half to write with one other author. They're never asked if they agree with anything else, never asked if they agree with the chapter, the underlying work, let alone the summary for policymakers, which is written by bureaucrats and politicians and pressure group lobbyists who are in one room down a hall where the lead authors of the chapters, which are compilations of these page to page and a half writings, and a runner runs back and forth telling the lead authors, the scientists, the pressure group lobbyists want you to change the following to be in harmony with the summary. Remember, this is a document that is produced generally, the summary of which is issued months before the actual underlying work is actually even written. That should tell you something. And this writing process whereby runners subject, very credentialed scientists, many of whom have dropped off, to the humiliation of having to change their underlying work to agree with something politicians want to say.
I was at a table with 3 Europeans. We were having lunch. And they were talking about their role as lead authors. And they were talking about how they were trying to make the report so dramatic that the United States would just have to sign up to the Kyoto Protocol.
Where the governments have placed all their belief in the IPCC have placed all their faith in the computer models.
General circulation models, or GCMs as we refer to them, are trying to simulate the climate of the Earth at the surface as well as through the upper atmosphere. The climate includes not only temperature and precipitation and cloud cover, but also the atmospheric winds, changes or the movement of these systems over time from one month to another, evaporation from the oceans and from the land, precipitation onto the surface, global ice, sea cover, all the aspects of the Earth, of the planet, that are related to the atmosphere and to the oceans.
It's very difficult to create a realistic computer model because the atmosphere and the surface of the Earth and the oceans and vegetation systems are all so very complex. And the ways that all of these components of the system interact are so complex. They interact in nonlinear ways, which we really can't predict. One thing changes, which changes something else, which changes something else. There's this cascade of processes.
People have to understand that the entire global climate change hysteria is driven by computer models. It is not driven by reality. Reality is not warming up like those models said it would.
There is not a computer in the world with the capacity to handle the data, but more important, to handle all of the calculations